The story of the Abbasid Caliphate is not simply about power gained and power lost. It is about how wealth can quietly reshape an empire long before its enemies ever arrive. Imagine Baghdad at its height, a city designed to be the center of the world, where gold flows as freely as water and knowledge is treated as a currency more valuable than armies. When the Abbasids rose to power in 750, overthrowing the Umayyads, they presented themselves as restorers of justice and balance. They promised a caliphate that belonged not to one tribe or ethnicity, but to the entire Islamic world. At first, this vision worked almost perfectly. The Abbasids built a sophisticated administrative system inspired by Persian governance, organized taxation with precision, and secured trade routes stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Wealth poured in from fertile farmlands, bustling ports, and the Silk Road itself. Baghdad became more than a capital. It became a symbol of abundance. Scholars, merchants, engineers, and poets flocked to the city, drawn by patronage and opportunity. The House of Wisdom stood as proof that this empire valued intellect as much as conquest. Scientific texts were translated, mathematics advanced, medicine evolved, and astronomy reached new heights. To the outside world, the Abbasid Caliphate appeared unstoppable. But beneath this brilliance, something dangerous was forming. Wealth, once a tool of stability, began to alter priorities. As the treasury expanded, so did the expectations of the court. Palaces grew larger, ceremonies more elaborate, and spending more aggressive. The caliph was no longer just a ruler. He was the focal point of a massive and expensive system that demanded constant maintenance. This shift did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, comfortably, almost invisibly. Governors in distant provinces noticed the change. They saw a center rich enough to overlook inefficiency and distant enough to tolerate disobedience. Autonomy began to grow at the edges of the empire, not through rebellion, but through neglect. Meanwhile, the Abbasids increasingly relied on professional soldiers rather than tribal loyalty. These troops were effective, disciplined, and dangerous, but their allegiance was tied to payment, not belief. And payment required continuous wealth. The empire assumed its prosperity was permanent, that trade would never slow and resources would never dry up. That assumption would become its greatest weakness, because when wealth feels endless, caution disappears, and when caution disappears, decline quietly begins. As the Abbasid Caliphate moved deeper into its golden age, the machinery of the empire grew heavier with every passing decade. The bureaucracy expanded, offices multiplied, and layers of administration piled on top of one another. At first, this complexity allowed the state to manage its vast territory efficiently, but over time, it became a burden. Decisions slowed, corruption found shelter in paperwork, and loyalty shifted from the caliphate to personal gain. The wealth that once unified the empire now fed competition within it. Court politics intensified as factions formed around powerful families, generals, and advisors. Influence became a currency, traded behind closed doors, often more valuable than official authority. The caliph, once an active and commanding figure, gradually became isolated by luxury and protocol. Real power began to slip into the hands of those who controlled access to him. Meanwhile, military expenses continued to rise. The Abbasids increasingly relied on Turkish slave soldiers, known for their effectiveness and discipline. These forces brought short-term stability, but long-term danger. They were loyal only as long as the payments continued, and their growing power altered the balance between ruler and army. The caliphate, once protected by ideology and unity, now depended on contracts and salaries. At the same time, provincial leaders grew bolder. Egypt, Persia, and other regions began operating with near independence, collecting taxes locally and sending only symbolic tribute to Baghdad. The empire still looked unified on maps, but in reality it was fragmenting from within. Trade routes faced disruption, agricultural productivity fluctuated, and revenues became less predictable. Yet spending did not slow. The court maintained its lifestyle, assuming recovery was always just around the corner. This imbalance between income and expenditure quietly weakened the state. When revolts erupted, they were no longer isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a deeper problem. The Abbasid Caliphate had become rich, powerful, and complacent all at once, and history shows that this combination rarely ends well. While scholars debated philosophy and poets celebrated the empire's greatness, the foundations were eroding. The system that once made the Abbasids exceptional was now making them vulnerable. The empire was still standing, still wealthy, still admired, but it was no longer resilient, and resilience once lost is almost impossible to recover. By the time the cracks became visible, the Abbasid Caliphate was already struggling to respond. External threats began to test an empire that had grown accustomed to internal comfort. Rival dynasties emerged, challenging Abbasid authority, not with ideology, but with efficiency. The Fatimids in North Africa and Egypt claimed legitimacy, while regional powers carved out their own domains under the Abbasid name. Baghdad remained symbolically important, but its ability to enforce control was fading. The military, once a tool of protection, became a political actor. Commanders influenced succession, manipulated court decisions, and occasionally ruled from behind the throne. The caliph's authority was no longer absolute. It was negotiated. Economic pressure intensified as trade routes shifted and instability discouraged commerce. Taxation became harsher, placing strain on farmers and merchants who had once fueled prosperity. Social unrest grew as inequality widened between the elite and the general population. The very wealth that once elevated the Abbasids now magnified resentment. Intellectual life continued, but it could no longer mask political weakness. When crises struck, responses were slow and fragmented. The empire lacked unity of command, clarity of purpose, and financial flexibility. Each problem fed the next, creating a cycle of decline that became increasingly difficult to break. The Abbasids did not collapse in a single moment. They eroded through accumulation. Every compromise weakened authority. Every concession reduced control. By the time external invasions loomed, the empire was already exhausted. It still possessed prestige, but prestige cannot stop armies. It still possessed wealth, but wealth cannot restore unity once it is lost. The caliphate was no longer shaping events. It was reacting to them, and reaction is always slower than ambition. The fall, when it came, was not shocking because it was sudden. It was shocking because it was inevitable. The final chapter of the Abbasid Caliphate was not written in gold, but in ashes. When the Mongols approached Baghdad in 1258, they did not face the unified, disciplined empire that once ruled the Islamic world. They encountered a weakened state, divided internally, overconfident in its symbolic status, and unprepared for absolute destruction. The sack of Baghdad was brutal, swift, and decisive. Libraries were burned, scholars killed, and the city that once defined global civilization was reduced to silence. This was not merely the fall of a city, it was the collapse of an era. The Abbasids had ruled through wealth, culture, and legitimacy, but they had failed to adapt when circumstances changed. Their story stands as a warning, etched into history. Wealth can build empires, but it can also soften them. Prosperity can inspire innovation, but it can also breed complacency. The Abbasid Caliphate did not fall because it lacked resources. It fell because it misunderstood the price of abundance. In the end, the empire that once controlled the flow of the world's riches could not control its own decline. And that is the true legacy of the Abbasids, not just a tale of greatness, but a lesson in how power, when left unchecked by discipline and foresight, slowly prepares its own downfall.